What if the quietest moments hold the loudest truths? This is a story for anyone who's ever felt unheard, unseen, and then, inexplicably, found their voice in the silence. I never intended to be at that gala. Let's be unequivocally clear. My name wasn't on the embossed invitation, my presence wasn't anticipated, and I had been explicitly told, with a chilling politeness, to stay away. Yet there I was, not for a confrontation, not to ignite a scene, but because an unshakable instinct demanded she witness me, truly see me, one final time. No longer would I be the phantom she drifted past in our shared home, nor the desperate text sender asking, "Are you all right?" while she was too exhausted to return. This time I had an anchor, a presence beside me that commanded gazes the instant we crossed the threshold, not for superficial allure, but for an almost palpable aura. She exuded a calm confidence, a quiet power. When she took my hand, it wasn't a territorial claim, but an authentic connection, a choice. And in that simple clasp, I felt more alive, more genuinely present than I had in the entire 5 years of my marriage. Then across the opulent room, I saw her, Tess. Her hand rested on a stranger's arm, a man I'd never encountered, but whose identity was irrelevant. She held a crystal flute, a carefree smile gracing her lips, radiating an ease that suggested she belonged entirely in his orbit, until her eyes, sharp and practiced, snagged on mine. The world around her seemed to cease. Her hand slid from his shoulder, her smile withered, and the vivid color drained from her face, leaving her stark and pale. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a raw fear flickered in her gaze as she looked at me. I offered no words, just a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. It was sufficient. Then I turned my back. In that instant, a profound clarity settled. I owed her no further explanation. Her decision had long been made. I was simply, at last, ready to make mine. But this journey, this stark moment of reckoning, didn't begin amidst the clink of glasses and hushed whispers of that evening. It started weeks prior, the night she declared me emotionally draining and vanished from our house, her wedding ring conspicuously absent from her finger. The soft click of the front door closing still echoes in my memory. The cavernous silence that swallowed me whole still suffocates. And what I unearthed in her closet that night, well, prepare for a revelation that shatters everything. After Tess departed ostensibly for air, I lingered in the hallway, a monument to foolish hope. An hour passed, then two. Overcome by a desperate need for tangible connection, I did something I hadn't dared in years. I opened her side of the closet, not to pry, but merely to remind myself of her presence, of the fragments of a life we once shared. Instead of solace, my fingers brushed against a small, unassuming envelope, tucked carelessly beneath a stack of silk scarves. It was barely hidden. I didn't hesitate. I opened it. Inside lay a handwritten note. I swear to you, my knees buckled, threatening to give out before I'd even processed the second line. It was a love letter, but not to me. It was addressed to someone named Troy. She called him her escape, her real self, her new beginning. And there, scrawled in her familiar, elegant script, was the sentence that branded itself onto my soul. He'll never leave me. He's too weak to walk away. He was me. I collapsed onto the edge of the bed, clutching that letter as if it were a weapon, or perhaps the last vestiges of my own shattered courage. Humiliation washed over me, a bitter current of being used. But worst of all, I felt an excruciating predictability. It was as if she had calculated every move, confident I would simply absorb the blow, fold into myself, just as I always had. That's when something inside me finally gave way. Not with a shout, not with an explosion of rage, but with a quiet, focused precision, like a hairline fracture spreading through tempered glass. When she returned hours later, I didn't yell. I didn't brandish the letter in her face. I didn't even allude to it. I simply met her gaze and said, "Hey, I think I'll be working late tomorrow." She nodded, her attention already elsewhere, barely registering my words. Perhaps she believed I had finally stopped caring. The chilling truth? I had finally begun to. The very next morning, a decisive shift. I went online and, with a tremor of anticipation, booked a table for two at the very venue she was slated to attend later that week. Not as her plus one, but a separate, meticulously planned reservation. This was not a coincidence. It was a declaration. Then came another, even bolder decision. I wouldn't walk in alone. And no, this isn't the tired cliche of hiring an escort or coercing a friend into a charade. I gambled on something far more volatile. I called the one person Tess had always, inexplicably, resented my closeness to, my former fiancé. And what happened next defied every expectation you could possibly have. It had been nearly 6 years since I'd last spoken to Serena Sinclair. She was the ghost from my past, Tess viewed as an eternal threat, despite the fact that nothing romantic had transpired between us since our breakup. Tess once dismissively called her the echo of Liam's better days, as if Serena was a constant reminder of the man I'd been before I became this iteration. Dull, compliant, invisible. The husband she could betray and expect only silent resignation from. So when I dialed Serena's number and haltingly asked if she would consider helping me make a profound statement, wordlessly, I half expected a dismissive laugh or an abrupt hang-up. Instead, there was a beat of silence, then her calm, steady voice. "Took you long enough, Liam?" She asked for no details, no explanations. She simply requested the time and address. That single exchange revealed more than any conversation could. She had suspected for years what I was only now beginning to comprehend, that Tess had meticulously crafted our marriage into an gilded cage, binding me with threads of guilt, obligation, and the illusion of being needed, but never truly loved, never truly chosen. The night of the gala, I drove to Serena's apartment to pick her up. My mind raced, rehearsing 100 different excuses should she suddenly decide to back out. But when she emerged, clad in a simple, elegant black dress, her only makeup a striking crimson lipstick, I realized she wasn't there for drama. She was there for me, not to rekindle a past romance, but to subtly remind me that I wasn't the spectral figure my wife had reduced me to. We exchanged few words on the drive over. There was no strategy to plan, no lines to rehearse. Her sheer presence alone would articulate everything. The gala was already in full, noisy swing when we arrived. Music thrummed, lights glittered, and the air was thick with the expensive, artificial laughter that only a certain echelon of upper-middle-class betrayal can produce. I opened the door for Serena, and as we stepped into the grand ballroom, it was as if an invisible record needle scraped across a vinyl album, creating a spiritual dissonance that cut through the chatter. And then I saw her, Tess. She was by the sprawling bar, her laughter tinkling, her hand lightly resting on some man's arm, as if it were the most natural, innocuous gesture in the world. It didn't matter who he wasn't the focal point. We were. Her head tilted up, her eyes met ours, and the breath caught in her throat. Her crystal flute slipped, not enough to shatter, but enough to spill a cold splash onto her designer gown. She didn't even notice. Her gaze was riveted, first on Serena, then on me, then snapping back again. Her jaw gave a tiny, almost imperceptible twitch. And that polished, manipulative confidence she wore like a signature perfume? It evaporated, replaced by a visceral dread. She had not anticipated this version of me, and she most certainly had not anticipated her. Tess uttered nothing immediately. She stood frozen, clutching her now empty glass as if it were her only anchor to reality. Her companion, a man whose face I still couldn't quite place, looked utterly bewildered. He leaned in, whispering something, likely asking if I was a friend, or perhaps, far worse in his mind, her brother. She didn't respond. She couldn't, because I wasn't just some vague figure from her distant past. I was the manifestation of the man she never imagined would resurface, somehow taller, shoulders broader, a subtle, knowing smile that clearly articulated, "You don't get to win this time." Serena remained utterly composed, no smirk, no triumphant gleam. She simply surveyed the room with an air of ownership before turning to me, a serene, entirely natural grin gracing her lips. "Fancy a drink?" she asked, as if this wasn't a moment thick with history and unspoken tension. I nodded, and we walked directly past Tess, not sparing her another glance. The party's hum resumed around us, yet a distinct shift in the room's energy was palpable. I felt the prickle of eyes on us. Her friends, no doubt, people who knew our story but never cared enough to interfere. The very same people who once gravely told me, "You're lucky she chose you." Lucky, I used to believe that too. At the bar, Serena and I engaged in effortless conversation. Nothing deeply personal, just carefully chosen words that broadcasted one undeniable truth. I was thriving. At one point, she touched my arm, a fleeting, casual gesture as she laughed, and I saw Tess watching from across the room. Her expression was a terrifying tableau of unreadable emotions, a shifting landscape between outright panic and simmering fury. I believe that was the precise moment she finally understood. I was no longer playing her twisted game. I wasn't shattered. I wasn't pleading. I was gone. The most liberating part? I didn't have to feign any of it. I truly was better. This wasn't about Serena. This wasn't about revenge. This was about finally stepping out of the suffocating fog my wife had deliberately kept me shrouded in for years. I didn't feel like a man trying to prove something. I felt like someone who had already departed, merely returned to reclaim the final splinter of his own soul. As we gravitated toward the balcony, Tess finally stirred. She followed. I heard the precise click of her heels behind me before her voice. A strained whisper cut through the din. Liam. My name. After weeks of chilling distance, calculated blame, and crushing silent treatments, suddenly it was Liam again. I turned slowly, not to engage in argument, not to unleash a stored-up fury, but simply to observe what she would say now that I was beyond her dominion. She opened her mouth, but the words faltered, caught in her throat, because Serena had turned, offering a gentle, knowing smile. Tess froze once more. "Can we talk?" she finally managed, her voice barely audible, as if the entire room wasn't spinning around her, as if her plea could somehow rewind time. I simply blinked. Not out of malice, but because hearing that tone again felt genuinely alien. Not cold, not smug, but laced with a profound uncertainty, the voice of someone who realizes they might have incinerated the wrong bridge. Serena offered me the subtlest of nods, then gracefully, deliberately, stepped away towards the bar, affording us space. It was a fluid, telling gesture. Another silent affirmation that I was no longer the man who required protection, but merely the one who had, at last, decided to protect himself. Tess edged closer, her eyes wide, glistening. "Is this some kind of payback?" she asked, but the fight had drained from her voice, replaced by raw panic. I felt an urge to laugh, but held it back. Not because I'm inherently better, but because it wasn't payback. And that, I knew, was what truly terrified her. This wasn't revenge. It was healing. She had no framework to process such a truth. "No," I stated simply, my voice unwavering. "This is me, finally not waiting." She attempted to speak again, but I raised a hand, a quiet but firm barrier. "You don't get to control this narrative anymore, Tess. You had your opportunity to talk when I asked if something was wrong. You had your chance when you declared me too exhausting to be around. You had your chance when you cunningly hid that letter in the closet, believing I'd never look." Her face blanched completely. Yes, she hadn't known I found it. "You said I'd never leave," I added, my voice sinking to a low, resonant tone. "And for a long time, you were right. But this, what you're witnessing now, is me already gone." She reached out, perhaps to touch my arm, perhaps to implore, but I took a measured step back. Not dramatically, not bitterly, but just enough to underscore that she no longer had access. Whatever key she once held to my life no longer fit the lock. Behind her, Serena waited, arms gently crossed, observing the unfolding moment with a quiet, unyielding strength. No smirk, no overt pride, just a calm, powerful presence. That's when Tess grasped a truth far more devastating than betrayal. She had become utterly irrelevant. And I had nothing left to say, so I turned. And for the first time in years, I didn't look back. The gala eventually concluded, but the ripple effect of that evening did not dissipate. Serena and I departed without any theatrics. No grand exit, no final, lingering glance. We simply walked out into the cool night air as if it belonged solely to us. I dropped her off, sharing a hug that lasted, perhaps, half a second too long. Back in my car, I sat for a moment, staring at my hands gripping the steering wheel. They weren't shaking. That surprised me. I had expected to feel hollow after facing tests like that. But what washed over me was a profound sense of peace. That should have been the end. But of course, it never is. By the time I arrived home, my phone glowed with 5 missed calls from Tess and 1 new voicemail. I ignored the calls. I paced the living room, shed my shoes, and poured myself a glass of water. Then, against my better judgment, I pressed play. Her voice was unsteady, breathless. "Liam, I don't know what you're doing. I mean, I know what you think you're doing, but we can't just pretend like everything's fine and throw each other out like trash. I messed up, okay? But it's not like you've been easy to live with either. Here's what no one tells you about manipulation." There it was, the classic pivot, not quite an apology, just enough performative accountability to lure a response, swiftly followed by a blame-shifting counterattack. That was her rhythm. Confess just enough to sound remorseful, then quickly remind me why she had strayed. "You shut down years ago," she continued, her voice growing firmer. "You became predictable, quiet. I needed more, and you just folded into yourself. But tonight, seeing you, I don't know who that was, and I don't like it." She didn't like it. That was the core message. Not regret, not sorrow, but the dawning realization that her control had vanished, that someone else, someone confident, calm, and unafraid, now stood where her doormat used to be. I didn't call her back, but I did something else. I quietly transferred half of our shared savings into a private account. Nothing illegal, nothing spiteful, just protective, just overdue. And I called a lawyer. No raging, no venting. I simply booked an appointment and wrote down a single clear sentence. "Let's discuss my options." That night I slept more soundly than I had in months. But when I awoke, something waited outside my front door, something I was utterly unprepared for. It was still early when I opened the door, anticipating nothing but the usual morning silence in Dukas steps. Instead, there sat an unmarked cardboard box, taped shut, like some kind of emotional landmine. My initial thought was that it might be from the lawyer, some documents or forms. But the instant I carried it inside and lifted the flap, my stomach clenched. Inside lay a scattered collection of items from our shared life, meticulously handpicked in a way that felt chillingly strategic. A watch I hadn't worn in years, an old pair of my glasses, a coaster from our honeymoon hotel in Santa Fe, my faded college hoodie, her favorite mug. None of it made sense, and all of it screamed one thing: manipulation masquerading as sentimentality. At the very bottom lay a single sheet of paper, not a letter, not even folded, just one devastating sentence penned in her unmistakable handwriting. "Are you really going to throw away everything we were?" I stood there for a long time staring at it. For a fleeting moment, I felt the familiar tug of guilt-driven nostalgia, that insidious inner voice whispering, "Maybe she's genuinely trying. Maybe this means something." But I slammed the door on it, hard, because what we were wasn't something I had thrown away. She had been systematically burning that bridge for months, for years. And now that the smoke was choking her, she wanted me to miraculously rebuild it. I packed the items back into the box, taped it closed, and left it in the garage. A few hours later, her text arrived. No greeting, no preamble, just, "I left you something. Thought you might feel something again." Again. As if feeling had ever been the problem. She had plenty of feelings, mostly for someone else's gym-toned arms and late-night attention. And now that she watched that story slip through her fingers, she wanted to rewind a few chapters and rewrite the ending. No, that part of me was unequivocally done. I didn't respond. I didn't argue. Instead, I went for a long walk. No phone, no headphones, just the quiet solitude of the air around me. And halfway along the park trail, my phone vibrated. A number I hadn't saved but instantly recognized. It was him, Troy, the man she had replaced me with. And what he said next would fundamentally change everything. I didn't answer immediately. I just stared at the screen, that unknown number blazing like a warning flare in my palm. But curiosity, an irresistible current, pulled me in. I stepped off the trail, seeking the shade of an ancient oak, and pressed accept. Liam. His voice was unnervingly calm, polite, as if he hadn't just orchestrated the implosion of my marriage. Yeah, I replied flatly. What do you want? There was a pause, then a weary sigh. Look, I'm not calling to fight or defend anything. I ended things with Tess. I said nothing. Not because I was hurt. I wasn't, not anymore. But because there was nothing to say. He continued explaining how she had lied to him too, promising she had left me emotionally, financially, legally, that she was free, that she wasn't cheating because, in her mind, we were already over. But then, he said, she started to unravel, obsessing over me, replaying our marriage like a distorted highlight reel. He told me she compared every little thing he did to how I used to do it. She's not who I thought she was, he admitted, a note of genuine disillusionment in his voice, and I think maybe she never was. That was the precise moment it finally arrived. Closure. Not because his words validated me, but because I realized her betrayal had absolutely nothing to do with me being boring, soft, or predictable. It had everything to do with her inability to truly love someone who gave without condition. She had catastrophically mistaken steadiness for weakness, and when the fleeting thrill of infidelity faded, she desperately sought chaos to feel something again. I hung up without another word, and I smiled. It was over. Not bitterly, not angrily, just utterly, peacefully over. Weeks drifted into months. The divorce proceeded without a hitch. I didn't drag my feet. I didn't look back. Serena and I maintained our connection, a platonic, respectful friendship. She even helped me find a new apartment, small, quiet, drenched in sunlight. For the first time in years, I threw open the windows, letting life, fresh and invigorating, pour in. One evening, I cooked dinner for myself. Just me. No expectations to meet, no one to impress. And then it hit me, a wave of profound understanding. I genuinely liked this version of Liam. He was enough. He always had been. I never needed to prove anything to Tess. I just needed to remember who I was before she made me forget.